8,000 years ago. Sometime around 5,800 BC, the fish swimming in the darkness of the Norway deeps, a sea trench off the Norwegian coast, sensed something. The seabed suddenly cracked and a massive earthquake shook. A landslip followed, and in moments the North Sea was sucked into the void. The sea retreated for hundreds of miles, making a tremendous whooshing noise. Those watching must have thought that the end of the world had come. And then seabirds shrieked and took to the air. They could hear the distant rumble of a huge tidal wave racing towards the shore. It smashed onto the coast at Inverness, snapping trees like matchsticks, killing all life in its path and strewing debris far inland. And leaving a dusting of white sand for archaeologists to find 7 millennia later at numbers 13 to 21 Castle Street in the middle of Inverness. Cataclysms like these mark the beginnings of Scotland. Now, prehistory may lack coherent stories, named individuals and precisely dated events, even much texture, but it does not lack drama. "5,000 years before the tsunami raced towards eastern Scotland, the world was changing even more dramatically. The cold was retreating across the face of the land. For millennia, all of what's now Scotland lay in the frozen grip of the last ice age. No human beings, animals or plants could survive in the ice storms. Incessant hurricanes raged around the flanks of the ice domes, cold mountains of snow and sleet packed hard into blocks more than half a mile thick. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that no memory of the many centuries of ice has come down to us, no account or legend to animate its endless horizons. But the ice made this landscape, and the landscape remembers it. The mountains, the lochs, glens, moorland and coastline of Scotland were all formed as the ice melted. This remarkable sea stack, now marooned in a field north of Oban, used to lie off an ancient coastline. But when the ice melted and its great weight lifted off the land, it bounced back and the sea seemed to recede. And here it's gone back about 50 metres and its level has dropped by about 15. But some parts of Scotland are still bouncing back, still rising 12,000 years after the ice melted. The reasons for the dramatic climate change which ended the last ice age are uncertain, but it appears that the Earth's tilt altered slightly and its orbit around the Sun became less elliptical and more circular, and this warmed up the surface of the planet. These sea cliffs here at Yesnaby in the Orkney Islands are said to be the oldest cliffs in Britain, and they're a very good example of how the ice sculpted the landscape. And as temperatures rose and meltwater roared in torrents, breaking out new watercourses, mapping out new river systems. As the weight was lifted off these cliffs and the ocean around them filled with meltwater, a new geography was made, the geography that we now recognise as Scotland. When the permafrost melted for a few months each summer, the tundra plains of Scotland greened over. Herds of flight animals like reindeer, deer and wild horses came north in search of fresh pasture, and following them, their predators also ventured north. Chief amongst these were men, hunting bands of pioneers who entered a new landscape. These courageous and enterprising people began slowly to understand that the world was indeed changing. These are the distant beginnings of the story of Scotland. If there existed hunter-gatherer communities in these glens before the last ice age, then the cold has wiped out all trace of them. The first pioneers who came north left us no stories. We do not know their names, and they seem barely to have touched the landscape. But these anonymous people begin our story, and their successors tell it more loudly and clearly as they approach us more closely in time. They were our ancestors, and they were the builders of great monuments, the standing stones at Callanish on Lewis, and the Ring of Brodgar, and the stones of Stenness on Orkney, the warriors who stood against the Roman legions at Mons Gropius, and the sculptors who carved the remarkable Pictish symbol stones. Over 9,000 years, easily the overwhelming balance of our history, these anonymous people tell Scotland's story. But they were not Scots, and their long experience of this place is often dismissed as prehistory, a preliminary, a precursor to real history, the comforting jingle of dates, kings and battles, which begins with the kingdom of the Scots in the 9th century. All that long time, from 8000 BC and the end of the last ice age, through the long time of the hunter-gatherers and the first farmers, the coming of metalworking, and a Celtic culture spread all over our country, the Roman invasions and the takeover of Gallic kings and the fall of the Pictish kingdom in the north. This is the immense scope of this series, the story of Scotland before the Scots. Where did our ancestors come from? Their mode of transport suggests strongly that they came up to Scotland from the south, and perhaps they travelled in dugout canoes like these two magnificent examples. Or perhaps they came here in the skin boats known as curraghs. The first pioneers who came north on hunting expeditions almost certainly came in boats. The sea and navigable rivers were the most reliable and fastest method of travel for a long time. And skin boats like coracles were easy to make. A framework is first lashed together in the shape of a hull, and then hides are stretched over it, sewn together and then caulked with resin or fat. Archaeologists have found the gossamer traces of an early hunting expedition in the Hebrides at the Rins of Islay. Near the Bamore distillery, an arrowhead was picked up which dated to around 10,800 BC, and it may show that some of the southern Hebrides were the first part of Scotland to be free of the ice. Around 9,400 BC, the weather was changing once again, and the summer hunting parties became impossible. The cold had begun to creep back over the land. What historians call the cold snap was beginning. Within only a few centuries, the ice had crept over the western highlands of Scotland. Centred over Rannoch Moor and the Lomond Mountains, a huge ice dome formed, and its looming bulk dominated the landscape. Around 8000 BC, a rapid thaw began. The ice domes groaned and cracked. Glaciers bulldozed rocky debris and dumped it as the ice melted. A landscape of humped little knobs and pools, what's known in Gaelic as Knockin agus Lochin, was created over wide areas in the Highlands, leaving ground suitable only for rough grazing and for hunting. The land rebounded once more, and seismic activity all over the Western Highlands caused landslips and rockfalls, creating an even more inhospitable landscape. But after the cold snap, bands of pioneers returned, and this landscape became known once again. Most of us think of the early peoples as primitives, as cavemen, but in fact, these people looked very much like us. And in part 2, we'll see that modern science has shown that they were indeed our direct ancestors. The pioneer hunters who populated prehistoric Scotland may seem like another species. But at Oxford University, Professor Brian Sykes has analysed the DNA of the modern population and compared it with DNA taken from the bones of prehistoric peoples, and the results are radical.
Well, in Britain as a whole, I think that most people in Britain, their ancestors, have been here a very long time, and basically the initial pattern that was set up when people first reached these islands all those thousands of years ago is still the one that is the most evident. We can see evidence of Viking genetic input in northern Scotland, in Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles Skye, and in parts of mainland Scotland. But it's never more than, even in Shetland and Orkney, it's never really more than about 30%. As to the rest, there's clearly a very strong connection with Ireland, but we've known that because of the Celtic arrivals in Ireland, the Dalriada. But I think the connections go way, way back, much further than that. And some of the most interesting connections, not just confined to Scotland and to the west of Britain, but also all along the Atlantic coast. You can see the same genes. What this means to me is that there was a very important, almost sea motorway, if you like, right up the Atlantic from northern Spain, right up the coast of France, right to Ireland, west of Wales, the west of Britain, up into Scandinavia. And that was the most influential and most important route into Britain for people that still live in those parts.
Some of the pioneers may have begun their journey north from here, Howick Haven on the Northumberland coast. An unusually observant walker on this cliff path noticed a few bits of sharp flint sticking out of the sand, and he recognized them for what they were. They were the debris of flint knapping, the process of making flint tools used by prehistoric peoples. Archaeologists had previously believed that these peoples lived in temporary camps, constantly moving on in search of a wild harvest or new sources of game, and they left very little trace, only a scatter of flints or a burnt area where fires had been lit. But at Howick, there were the post holes and hearths of a substantial wooden building, thatched, comfortable and weathertight.
The most surprising thing about Howick when we got here was the fact that it was rebuilt so many times on the same footprint, and when we look at the radiocarbon dates, that it was occupied for so long. This is more or less unprecedented for this period anywhere in Northern Europe. The hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic have tended to be regarded as highly mobile people, and the structure we found here at Howick just does not give an impression of an ephemeral settlement. It was rebuilt 3 times in precisely the same footprint, and it was quite a robust structure. Post holes were very large. It seems to be a permanent or a semi-permanent structure. The fact that it was rebuilt and we couldn't see any hiatus in settlement really does suggest that if people weren't encamped here permanently through the year, they were probably visiting this site several times a year, or at least staying here several months of the year. It does upset the theory that we've generally worked with small ephemeral encampments and people moving about after their resources. They could stay put and they could feed themselves permanently in some locales.
On a clear day, the hunter-gatherers who lived here on the Northumberland coast could have looked out over the North Sea and seen the low horizon of another shore, the shore of a lost subcontinent. On a dark November night in 1931, the Calinda was out fishing. The skipper noticed a lump of black peat come up in the nets, and puzzled, he broke it open to find something remarkable. It was a small carved bone harpoon, and it was the first trace of the lost subcontinent of Doggerland. It was created when the ice pressed on the land to the north and forced the North Sea bed to rise. It may well be that many of the first pioneers who peopled Scotland after the retreat of the ice originally came from Doggerland.
The view would have been very different indeed. When you looked out to sea, you wouldn't have seen an uninterrupted horizon of sea. You would have seen low lands to our southeast. These were the Dogger Hills. The Dogger Bank would have been a series of low hills covered with probably quite dense woodland. In that woodland, it was low-lying. It would have been covered with small lakes and swamps and marshes, and people lived there as well. So it wasn't only a change of the physical geography, there was also a change of cultural geography, where across this embayment by 60, 70 miles as the crow flies, you would have had other cultures, other people with whom you had trade relations and so forth. It was the home of God knows how many hunter-gatherers, and it was hunting grounds and a place where people from British Isles would also move across. And it's possible, given the distance, that they had greater cultural affinity in Northumberland with those people on Dogger Bank than they would have with those people living in Kent or Cornwall. In fact, as the crow flies, it's much nearer, and again, it's with Dogger Bank as largely dry land, it's almost equidistant from here to the Danish coast as it is from here to London. So the cultural geography and the lines of communication would have been very much different than anything that we could possibly imagine from the historic record. Doggerland ended really when the last major rise of sea level occurred. The pollen zone, they call it the Atlantic pollen zone, where we saw a rise of at least 2.5, 3 meters, and this occurred at about 4000 BC at its maximum, and that finally swamped the last bit of Doggerland. It might have been exposed at low tide occasionally, as portions are now, but being habitable land, that was about the end of it.
Behind the settlement at Howick lay the vast expanse of the wildwood. In the 8th millennium BC, Britain was carpeted by forest, and a green canopy stretched far away, as far as the eye could see. In the wildwood lived the animals hunted by the community at Howick. They went out after the roe deer, the red deer, the wild boar, other smaller species, and the great wild cattle known as the auroch. DNA studies of these magnificent beasts at Chillingham Castle in Northumberland confirm a long link with the prehistoric past.
Well, they're descended from the auroch. That's the wild ox that roamed Europe from before the Ice Age, when Britain was still attached to Europe. And they were huge creatures, stood 6 feet at the shoulders, much bigger than these are, but they're now extinct, some 1500 BC in fact. You've probably noticed that the cow's horns tend to be lyre-shaped. They curl in and backwards, whereas the bull's horns stick out and forwards. And the adult bulls tend to be dirtier than the rest, because prior to fighting they dig up the ground with their hooves no horns and mess in the hole and rub themselves in it. It's a bit like putting on war paint. These have got a king bull system, and this is him. This is where the king bull is the father of all the calves that are sired during his reign. And his reign isn't likely to be more than 3 years. The calves are born all year round, and the first indication that a cow is going to have a calf usually is when she breaks away from the herd and goes off on her own into the undergrowth and has it. And she'll leave it hidden like a deer does. And the cattle themselves are never touched by humans. There's no vet ever called. And that's because in the past, any occasion that they have been touched by humans, the herd has killed the one that's been touched. They won't tolerate the smell of humans on them. When they go to such lengths as killing their own young, it makes you realise how ancient they are. This is nature in the raw.
As well as hunting animals, these people also gathered fruits, nuts, berries and vegetables from the wood. English has forgotten many of these wild foods, but Gaelic has not. Silverweed is seen as just that, a weed, but in Gaelic it was boiled, roasted, dried and made into a powder and then used to make porridge. And an old poem recalls its great versatility. Honey underground, silverweed of spring, honey and condiment, whisked way of summer, honey and fruitage, carrot of autumn, honey and crunching, nuts of winter. That poem was first written down in the 19th century, but it speaks of much older attitudes and much older habits. And it also draws our prehistoric ancestors closer to us. It makes them human rather than a bunch of grunting savages. And it also shows that they deserve a proper history and that they deserve our respect. For the truth is that these people are remote from us only in time. The ownership of rights to hunt and fish was a matter of life and death to our ancestors. On the tidal island of Oronsay in the Hebrides, piles of prehistoric rubbish appear to have asserted ownership, but in a disconcerting way. These grassy mounds by the shore are in fact shell middens, dumps of millions of shells from mussels, clams, limpets, oysters, scallops and razors. Around 5000 BC, a community of fishermen lived on the island, living round here. And over time, and at different times of the year, they built up these huge mounds of discarded shells. There's an air of mystery about the middens. A part of what seems to be a simple story is missing. Why were there several different middens deliberately piled up at different times of the year? Oronsay is a very small island, and surely the fishermen didn't uproot and move half a mile so that they could deposit shells in another place. There is a whisper of ritual here. It seems that the island of Oronsay was holy and that these middens had a religious significance of some unknown sort. When archaeologists discovered the remains of a burial in one, this interpretation seemed to be confirmed. 7,000 years ago, human fingers had been carefully placed on a seal's flipper and then buried in a midden. What did this mean? Remains like the shell middens found in Oronsay are from communities of hunter-gatherers, and they date from 6,700 BC to 3000 BC. Far away from the island of Oronsay, over the other side of what became the North Sea in Denmark, archaeologists came across a contemporary burial of a mother and her baby. They were part of a hunter-gatherer band. The baby had been placed on a swan's wing and laid next to his mother. Perhaps both of them had died in childbirth. This ritual and the burial of the fingers on a seal flipper on Oronsay seem like the distant echoes of a belief in an afterlife, the unmistakable sense of ancient symbolism. Perhaps the soul of the baby was thought to fly in the evening sky with the great white birds, while on Oronsay there was a sense that souls swam with the seals in the deeps of the world. And perhaps the burial of the dead in this way reinforced the idea of the rights of ownership on the island of Oronsay. The land and the sea nourished these people, and it may be that they thought it was fitting to place their bodies inside the remains of all that natural bounty. Now, we may see these mounds as no more than piles of smelly prehistoric rubbish and turn up our delicate noses at them. But to the peoples who lived on the islands, the middens may have had the odour of sanctity about them. Human bones have been retrieved from middens all over coastal Scotland. They're the remains of some of Scotland's earliest hunter-gatherer communities, and it's surely significant that they were buried along with the shells and carcasses of what they hunted and gathered. Burial practices in the Hebrides have changed, but hunting expeditions still go on. From the island of Lewis, an ancient journey has been made since a time out of mind. From the village of Ness, men sail out to Sulishgear, a rocky island 30 miles northwest of the Butt of Lewis. Gannets nest on Sulishgear, and the young birds are known as guga and much prized and savoured by islanders. And these ancient hunting practices also survived elsewhere. Within living memory, the men of the islands of Westray and Coppensay in the Orkneys have gone out swapping for axe, or hunting for young seabirds using nets and the same sorts of snares that the Lewis men use on Sulishgear. It is also an excellent example of what historians call the enduring pattern, which means, broadly speaking, that in similar geographical and economic and social circumstances, communities maintain habits of life and mind over immense periods. Often, the origins of these habits are long lost in the mists of time. No one can recall when they began, and they're always done by the community, for the community. Why do traces of the enduring pattern seem clearer in the Hebrides and in the Western Highlands?
The West is an elemental land where you're close to the sea, the land and the sky. And I think if you live in that triangle, that elemental triangle, where the hand of man is not to be seen readily, you are almost at the beginning of time. So you link with the past very readily. And it's not surprising that although other creeds have intervened and come in from elsewhere, I think the rootedness, the ancient roots, social roots of these meant that they've been more tenacious and have lasted, many of them, so many of them, into our own day, without our realising that we carry them on. In fact, if we don't, if, for example, people wouldn't go to Sulishgear one year to get the young gannet, people like me would feel a lack, that something was missing out of the very pattern of our social being.
Unlike the guga hunters, the people of St Kilda hunted more often for seabirds. Their constant scaling of the cliffs meant that they developed heavily muscled legs and ankles and were well equipped for the treacherous climbs. More evidence of these enduring patterns of life can be seen at the Tomb of the Eagles on the Orkney island of South Ronaldsay. Parts of more than 340 skeletons were discovered in the 1950s by the local farmer. When the skeletons in the Tomb of the Eagles were examined, it was noted that they too had developed exactly the same kind of musculature. And it's clear what they had been doing. Just below the tomb are high sea cliffs where many seabirds nest, offering easy prey. And it's striking evidence of the enduring pattern, a continuity stretching over 5,000 years.
I think the whole instance of sunwise and so many things that are linked with that, the sea and its power and our ambivalence towards it, hunting on the sea, fishing, the produce from the sea, all the danger, all the delight, all the knowledge, all the satisfaction attached to that, seabirds and the whole thing of hunting for birds, instanced in St Kilda, Faroes, and continued to this day in my native Ness, and is a part of our very make-up. It is not a superficial thing or even a luxury, although some people see it as a luxury, that kind of food is not needed today. And so with medicinal plants, the way that people knew of everyday things around them, because their lives were very elemental, they were closely linked to the land, to the sky, to the sea, which was largely unchanged.
Other patterns are obvious. Britain is still a nation of fishermen and women, and the same qualities have endured. Fishing in lochs and rivers needs patience and skill. Prehistoric hunters could spear fish from a coracle and feed their families. The only difficulty was that in summer fish spoiled quickly and had to be gutted, roasted and eaten almost there and then.
I also think of what we call in Gaelic the envelope of the year and how it was divided seasonally, because people must have been aware of lunar changes and diurnal patterns, and of course the big festivals, which we tend to think of as being Celtic festivals. But I suspect, and the more we'll know, the more we'll realise that they'll be much older than that. Beltane, wonderful Beltane at the beginning of the summer, and so on. And probably the most amazing one of all, Saving, Halloween. Strange darkness, all social rules suspended, a magical time, in touch with the dead, entering into fairy mounds, social restrictions lifted, people putting on masks to become other selves. I mean, these are ancient, these link us with the past without our realising it.
Hunter-gatherer bands had to be mobile. They may have moved between winter and summer camps, following the migrations of animals and the seasonal ripening of the wild harvest, and something as straightforward as the need for a new supply of firewood will have often forced communities to move on. Mobility could have been compromised if mothers in the band had been forced to carry more than one baby, and so they suckled their children for much longer so that they themselves remained unable to conceive. The wildwood teemed with game, and where hunters could see clear tracks, a snare was often enough to catch small prey like otters, pine martens or badgers. When deer or wild boar were wanted, hunting bands used the old Scottish method of the drive and set. Beaters would drive animals through woodland towards a place where hunters with spears and arrows could kill them, or they would drive them to their death or disablement over a natural feature like a cliff. Very early, it seems that hunting bands began to domesticate wolves. Their primary use seems to have been in the drive and set. Burials of hunting dogs have been found in Denmark and Germany, and they were given much honor. As it is today, hunting in prehistoric times was associated with an elite. A rich burial found near Inverness contained the accoutrements of archery. It was efficient and easy to catch animals with a snare, but much more exciting to chase and catch a powerful beast like a boar or the huge wild cattle known as aurochs. And prestige appears to have been attached to the excitement of the chase. Hunters were also gatherers, and on the island of Colonsay, immediately to the north of the Shell Middens of Oronsay, spectacular evidence of their efficiency was found. Because of its distance from the mainland, there were no squirrels on Colonsay, and hazel trees remained loaded with nuts in the autumn, and this allowed them to propagate all over the island. Carbon dating of hazelnut shells show that a tremendous harvest was gathered in one season sometime around 6,700 BC. Many people must have been involved, but the nuts were not merely picked. The harvesters appear to have destroyed many of the trees. This was deliberate and feels like some sort of religious act. Perhaps on Colonsay they were making a sacrifice of some sort by obliterating the source of what was a valuable staple needed for the winter. And there's a strong sense of a ritualized relationship with the land, something directed by a higher authority, a priestly elite perhaps. While these shell middens were being piled up on Oronsay, sometime between 5,300 BC and 4,300 BC, it seems that all of the neighbouring islands in the southern Hebrides were deserted. While the community fished off this tiny island, no one was living on Colonsay, Islay, Jura or Rum. At the very least, this speaks of choices made about the land and where people should live, hunt and gather their food, even if we don't know what lay behind those choices. Hunter-gatherer societies had an umbilical relationship with the land. We may think of the Scottish landscape as home, but we no longer inhabit it as they did. The land let them live. They hunted and harvested its natural bounty and planted their ancestors inside it. They probably had no sense as we do of the land as property. It was not something that they owned. It was them and they were it. Until the 19th century, this was an overwhelmingly rural society with no large towns and a people who worked the land, often the same piece of land, for uncounted generations. And when the forced emigrations began and were followed by later voluntary departures, many Welsh, Irish and Scots Celts suffered badly, often physically, from what commentators miscalled homesickness.
I think when people are closely attached to elemental place and to the elements of place, where family unit and extended family unit is very strong, largely because of that continuity, where one is known to nae hundreds or thousands of people who know of you because of the kind of society it is. The paradox is that on island life you're known to many, many more than you are in any urban setting where anonymity is the name of the game. On rural island places where you're known to thousands, family known to thousands, not just the present but the past, you're linked to the sea, to the sky, to the land. For a human being, or for the brain to be removed from that, is almost a violence.
The prehistoric peoples of Scotland loved their land. There can be no doubt about that. But like the Aborigines, their relationship with it was complex. They were buried inside it, and it was inside them, indivisible. Something of these powerful sentiments inhabited the minds of the people who lived here at Clawhallen in South Uist. Claw means a burial ground, and when the archaeologists began to dig amongst the sand dunes, they found the remains of a small community living on top of a prehistoric cemetery.
The recently excavated Clawhallen in South Uist is just a wonderful example of how mankind is capable of being attuned to the movement of the sun and building houses in terms of that, with the openings facing the east and the pattern of the day, birth in the first quadrant, work in the second quadrant, then sleeping and death in the northern half. And next to the sleeping area where there was heather and turf, under the floor, a body buried. In one instance, a body that had been mummified, if you like, in peat for 400 years. But the skull was not the skull that belonged to that body, DNA shows us. Now that fascinates me. Did man then think at that stage, was the heart still to the fore, or was he conceiving of the brain and of the head as the Celts had, and worshipped the head and adored the head? Is that an awareness of this wonderful, most perplexing thing that you can imagine, the human brain and what it can do? The idea of home and bringing the dead in as part of the cycle of home and belonging is amazingly interesting and comforting, as it must have been for them.
On the Orkney Islands, the Tomb of the Eagles looks like a natural feature, but when the farmer Ronald Simonson dug his way into the burial chamber, he saw an unforgettable sight.
A lot of skulls lying on the floor, but there was mostly in the side chambers. Leg bones and ribs was in the chambers in the end of the tomb. And there was some skulls on the floor as well. They were more in sort of mud down at the bottom. They were more fragile. I think that there was the bones of 9 eagles, I think, altogether. I think so. There's 64 claws written off. The eagle would be the emblem of the tribe. There's a tomb outside of Finstone, Cuween, and when that was excavated, there was 24 dog skulls in it, but only 7 human bodies or skulls. So that would have been the clan of the dog. And there's no dogs here, so there'd be the eagle would seem to be the biggest percentage of birds' bones was eagle bones.
Our ancestors revered, even worshipped the dead, and were somehow comforted by them. And yet now it appears that we find the presence of the dead uncomfortable. Perhaps we should be less apprehensive, give our ancestors a more central place in our lives. Although the lessons are hard to understand, it seems that across immense spans of time, the prehistoric peoples of Scotland are trying to remind us of something. They're trying to remind us to be more respectful. the beginning of the 4th millennium BC, the early peoples of Scotland began to create mysteries. And we're sailing towards one of them, towards the great standing stones at Callanish on the island of Lewis. But all over Scotland, people began to dig ditches, raise banks, and great tombs were built. After 4000 BC, the land began to produce enough surplus to allow work to be done on the great religious monuments, and this carried on in changing forms until around 1000 BC. And these magnificent monuments signal a momentous change in the lives of the early farming communities. And their unifying theme appears to have been a grim one. Death caused the great monuments to be raised, and their function seems to have been closely related to the burial and commemoration of the dead. But past that general observation, little more is immediately evident. What exactly took place at the standing stones of Callanish on the Isle of Lewis is a mystery. No one knows. Working out the nature of the ceremonial which happened in impressive places like this is a bit like trying to piece together the details of Christian worship by only looking at the ruins of, for example, the great border abbeys. It's impossible to do anything but guess. And to heap up further confusion, it may be that the exclusive association of these great monuments with death is itself mistaken, or at least incomplete. Perhaps important births were celebrated here, perhaps the renewal of the seasons, perhaps the bringing in of the harvest. One thing is certain. What caused these monuments to rise was the greatest revolution in human history. Around 4000 BC, new ideas were arriving in Scotland. Farming began, and life in the land were changed forever. The cultivation of sown crops and the domestication of animals combined with hunting, gathering and fishing to shape a new way of life. The changes were gradual. Much of the north and west isn't suitable for cultivation, and the coastal peoples had access to a rich larder of natural resources. There was hesitation in northwest Europe, a resistance to the new methods. Some of the innovative aspects of farming may have been adopted for a time and then abandoned by the hunter-gatherer bands as they went back to the old way of living off the wild. There were patches and periods of hesitation, but there's no doubt that over the span of the 4th millennium BC, immense changes swept over the countryside of Scotland.
About 10,000 years ago, and farming was invented essentially in Mesopotamia, and it basically allowed far more people to live on the same patch of land. So it was a very successful, in genetic terms, sort of package, and it led to expansions, and farmers moved out as Mesopotamia got too crowded. They moved out and were able to expand into Europe. People whose ancestors were farmers in Ireland and in Western Scotland have that DNA. They have that Mediterranean type of farming DNA. So although there certainly are genetic ingredients from that time, they're not overwhelming. They're getting up to about 20%. They're slightly less, as you might expect, in Ireland and the west of Scotland than they are in other parts of Europe. On the east side of Britain, the farming DNA that arrives has mainly come from continental Europe. So there's quite a divide, as if one set of farmers went off, which they did along the Mediterranean, and then populated the west side of Britain. The others came through Central Europe and then across the North Sea, the English Channel, to populate the east side of Britain. And you can still see those patterns in Britain today.
This was a profound cultural change, and the patterns of early farming have endured almost unaltered for 6,000 years. Food historians have produced a set of statistics which are fascinating, and they show clearly how long these patterns have endured. Although farming methods and machinery have been revolutionized in the last 6,000 years, what humans eat and cultivate has actually changed very little. In fact, only 14 species have been domesticated from the 148 breeds of large animals to choose from. And out of 200,000 available plant species, only around 100 have been adapted for cultivation. On the banks of the River Dee, not far from Aberdeen, this innocuous cornfield holds another mystery, a mystery perhaps even greater than the secrets of Callanish. Although there's absolutely nothing on the ground to suggest it now, aerial photography detected a set of crop marks which gave away the outline of a very large timber hall. Nothing like it had been found anywhere else in Britain, and since the dig here at Balbridie, traces of 3 other very large timber halls have been found in Scotland. All of them are on the banks of great rivers which flow into the North Sea, and all of them date to about 3,900 BC. So were the great halls raised by new people from the east, people who were skilled farmers?
My own feeling is that the people who built Balbridie and Cleish did come up the rivers from the coast, but that they hadn't sailed straight across from North Germany or Denmark. That we can see connections with the pottery, for example, with northern France and Belgium, and that perhaps landfall somewhere in Yorkshire, and the spread of farming as an idea, and I think with people from that point. Balbridie and Cleish, which is the other site which I excavated myself, were both discovered in 1977 by aerial photography in areas that before that had virtually no Neolithic presence visible at all. Balbridie was excavated in the late 1970s, Cleish more recently, but the remarkable thing is the tremendous similarities between two sites, down to minute detail. What they are long timber buildings within which there is a clearly defined open space in the centre, probably with hearths, with burning. But to get to that space, you have to pass through a number of other spaces which are broken down by screens. So you'd probably be coming from the light into a dark space which appears very encumbered with posts holding up the roof. And then finally you emerge into what would be quite a large open space, larger than the floor plan of a small flat actually. But what was in that, it's very difficult to know.
Ideas require description, and sometimes new ideas bring new languages. And some prehistorians have contended that in the 4th millennium BC, when farming spread out from what's now modern-day Iraq, it also distributed the Indo-European group of languages all over Europe and as far east as the Bay of Bengal. Now, this group of languages may baffle us when we go on holiday, but in fact, they are very like each other. And interestingly, words associated with close family relationships are often also very like each other. For example, frater in Greek and braher in Gaelic are clearly the same word as brother, bruter, and most versions in between. And there are plenty of other examples. Mater in Greek and maher in Gaelic for mother, mutter, and so on. And words common to both languages often drop an initial consonant or are aspirated, so that aher in Gaelic for father is from pater in Latin for the same word, and lan in Gaelic for full is from plenus in Latin for the same word, but without, of course, the initial P. Radical language shifts have taken place in Scotland within the space of only 2 or 3 generations and without any substantial immigration to stimulate them. In some parts of the Highlands, Gaelic has been entirely replaced by English, and in Perthshire there's no one now who speaks the native dialect of Gaelic, while in the 1971 census there were 477 monoglot Gaelic speakers. There are none now. It may very well be that in the 4th millennium BC, the gradual spread of new methods of food production caused a radical language shift, new words to describe new ways of growing food. But farming could also be dangerous. Once men and women began to live close to animals and to depend on them for food, diseases jumped the species barrier. People caught tuberculosis from cows, influenza from birds, and whooping cough and malaria from pigs. When there was little or no resistance to these new diseases, they could have cut a deadly swathe through large populations. Almost always, it seems, the early peoples of Scotland chose beautiful and atmospheric places to meet and worship. And when the early peoples first walked up Cairnpapel Hill near Linlithgow, sometime around 3500 BC, they moved through a landscape which was changing. Ideas of farming were spreading in the valleys and the plains at the foot of the hill. And when the worshippers came up here, they brought sacred woods with them, hazel and oak. And in 6 hearths around the summit, they lit fires. And also, they buried pieces of pottery and axes in the ground around the fires. These were valuable items, and it seems that their deposit up here on the hill denoted some sort of act of sacrifice or propitiation. In the 4th millennium BC, the old gods were not necessarily gods of love, or even particularly well disposed towards the people who prayed to them. They could be malign as well as benign. And so to keep them happy, the early peoples buried precious items in high places like this. This habit lasted a long time. By the 1st millennium BC, metalwork had replaced pottery in the scale of value, and the Celtic peoples of Scotland used it to propitiate their gods. Fond of watery places such as lochs, lochans, mosses and rivers, they came to their shores and threw swords, shields, daggers, cauldrons and much else into their depths. And like the people who climbed Cairnpapel Hill and broke their pots, they damaged these precious metal objects before committing them to the gods. Sometime after 3500 BC, Cairnpapel Hill changed. To mark off the crest of the hill as a sacred place, somewhere apart from the surrounding temporal world, a circular ditch was dug and the upcast used to form a bank on its outside edge. This rose to 1.2 meters in places, high enough to act as a screen. Inside the ditch, 24 timber posts were raised in a circle, and what became known as a henge was created. But why? What was it for?
All sorts of explanations have been erected for the henges. Either the bank is there to stop people seeing in, or the bank is there as a grandstand so people can see better. Now, this doesn't actually work on all the henge monuments because some of them are very large, some are very small. The bank in some of them is so low they could never have acted either as a rampart or as a visual barrier. And what's been suggested in relation to similar looking sites in the Irish Iron Age is that they are in fact defensive sites. but they're being erected to defend the real world against something dangerous inside the enclosure. Presumably it has been identified as dangerous by the people who can then gain some considerable benefit and kudos and power from being the intermediaries between yourselves and whatever is dangerous inside the enclosure.
Inside this modern shelter are the remains of 2 late burials on Cairnpapel Hill. Over a stone-lined grave sits a massive capstone, something to deter anyone from robbing the grave or desecrating it. And next to it there's an even more impressive tomb. Now this must have been the last resting place of a very important person, perhaps even a king. And this grave was dug long after the henge went out of use. Place names sometimes recall ancient sanctity, and Cairnpapel is from Carn for a rock, and Papar, the Irish Gaelic word for a priest, and so Cairnpapel means the priest's rock. Like many others in central and southern Scotland, the henge at Cairnpapel was made from perishable timber posts. The remains of large wooden henges have been detected in Galloway, Perthshire and in Angus, but there's nothing now left showing above the ground. In the treeless north of Scotland, others have survived in stone and spectacularly on Orkney at the Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stenness. Understandably, Orkney has been seen as the centre of a flourishing prehistoric culture, but that may be so because of the accident of survival of so many stone monuments. The stones have survived, but the ideas and culture of the people who built them have not.
Well, the people who built the Ring of Brodgar were farmers settled in Orkney. They were living around the Ring of Brodgar in villages. They were living in Skara Brae style houses. And at the time, for instance, the Stones of Stenness went up, there's actually a village next door where we can imagine that the builders of the Stones of Stenness lived and put up the monument itself. So you've got a settled kind of society.
A remarkable and recent discovery also in Orkney has puzzled archaeologists. At the mound of Mine Howe, a stone-lined shaft has been sunk directly into the ground.
It's the underground structure surrounded by this enormous ditch, and it was never lived on. So Mine Howe, as far as we can see, is a spiritual resort, probably as important to the Iron Age people as, for instance, the henges were to the Neolithic. At the bottom of this very long stair is a cistern which would have probably held water. You're very in the dark and isolated. It would seem to me to be a place where people can actually go to communicate with the spirit world. I mean, we know that the Celts were very interested in the underworld and spirit life. So it seems that if you can isolate yourself, you can perhaps communicate with the gods of the underworld, if you like.